My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing
Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our look at trade, technology, and China with Wendy Cutler, Carolyn Brehm, and Francine Lamoriello. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University, and this is Diplomatic Immunity. This episode is part of a series on the Biden administration's foreign policy and diplomacy. In part 1 of this episode, we discussed what a worker-centric trade policy looks like, the shift in U.S.-China trade over the decades, supply chains, and balancing human rights issues and national economic goals. If you haven't listened to the first part of our conversation, I suggest hopping back into your podcast feed to catch up with this and earlier episodes in the season. For the second half of this episode, I started by bringing Europe into the conversation and asking Francine about last year's announcement of a new Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. Let's have a listen. Francine, I want to ask you a specific question at this point, and we've just, I just mentioned tech companies, and trade and technology policy increasingly are going hand in hand these days. And President Biden and some European allies recently announced the formation of the USEU Trade and Technology Council. This happened last June, which seeks to create a shared approach to innovation, critical infrastructure, technological investment. Why do you think this is important, and what do you see coming out of this?
Well, thank you, Kelly. I do view the USEU Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, as an important step forward in US-EU cooperation. I think the goal of the US and the EU working together to address common problems and challenges has been a goal for some time of U.S. trade and economic policy. And so I'm happy that the Biden administration and the EU Commission have initiated this. I will say I think it's important to highlight that the work of the TTC will not be limited to issues surrounding the technology sector itself, but rather will seek to address global challenges that threaten the growth and competitiveness of many industrial sectors. In my view, this should include a commitment to addressing barriers to innovation and growth, both in our own two regions, as well as in third countries, in other countries. So our industry is really looking at the TTC as a way to promote greater regulatory alignment for our sector. We'd like to see a reaffirmation of a commitment to good regulatory practices. This is so important for continued innovation and competitiveness of our industry. And we hope that the TTC can lead to creative solutions to resolve trade and regulatory barriers that our companies in the United States and Europe are commonly facing in third countries. And this may touch on the first question, but for the Biden administration, I believe initiatives such as the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the Indo-Pacific Framework, offer an opportunity to advance pro-growth and pro-trade policies that previously might have been included in free trade agreements. For example, the TPP and the USMCA. Another important opportunity is the APEC. And the U.S. has just announced that its bid has been accepted to host the next cycle and the meeting of the APEC in 2023, which I think is going to be giving more impetus and another place for the administration to advance a positive trade agenda there.
And just to, again, a lot of this, ties back to China as well with this, the new, especially with the new European Council, as far as technology innovation goes and trade in the technological sector. Do you, and I'd like to briefly, any of you answer this or speak on this issue of again, it talks about, it gets to the idea of bringing your allies and partners along if you want to create a trade policy towards a strategic rival like that. So where does this play into that, and how do you see the future of EU trade and China relations playing out as in light of U.S. policy?
Well, keeping the U.S. and the EU together as we approach issues we're facing in common in China with respect to trade practices, with respect to China's role in the global trading system. I think this is challenging, and an initiative like the TTC could be helpful there. I don't minimize how difficult that will be over the long term. I think there is an expectation that the US and the EU, through this new initiative, will look for ways to address together, to approach China from a position of more unity, to try to look for creative solutions. But I think that's somewhat in the background, if you will. It's not. I think I would stop there. I do think that there will be continued challenges as Europe has its own objectives and goals to expand trade and its economic relationship with China, perhaps a different cultural, historical viewpoint on how to do business there. And this initiative can help, but I don't think it'll be a panacea for suddenly having the U.S. and U.S. and Europe speaking with one voice on all matters related to China.
I think working with allies and partners, particularly the EU, is critical on the range of issues that Francine mentioned. And while we share many concerns, I think we also have to be realistic that our approaches on certain issues are going to be different. Areas where the United States, for example, wants to push really hard, Europe may not be as interested. But I think if you look at the trajectory, it does seem that Europe is becoming increasingly disillusioned and more realistic vis-a-vis China than it has in the past. And I think that opens up more doors for cooperation. I was particularly struck by the settlement between the United States and the EU on the long-time aircraft dispute. And it was interesting for me because they didn't really settle the details. It was almost like there was an agreement that we need to just put this issue behind us so we can work together on the real challenge that's affecting both of us. And so maybe that, the more we can put behind us the bilateral irritants behind Brussels and Washington, the greater avenues for cooperation with Europe. But again, Europe's not monolith. Member states have different views, and that's always going to be the challenge in working with Europe.
Yeah, so the last question, and this is for all of you, and we've been talking about government policies and what the Biden administration is doing, what the EU is doing, but flipping that around, what has been the business community's view of the Biden administration and their approach to trade so far, in your estimation? And this is for all of you or any of you.
Well, maybe I'll start. I mean, I think as we've spoken about earlier, the administration has had an emphasis on cooperation with allies and re-engagement in multilateral institutions. This has been, an important part of their approach so far. And I think that should be viewed positively by the private sector. President Biden, again, as you mentioned earlier, has signaled that, a clear focus on first rebuilding the U.S. economy and supporting the middle class. That's the number one priority. But, I think the business community understands that cannot be achieved without a corresponding focus on the global economy. So I think there's some hope and expectation that the administration will increase its attention on trade. You'll see the Chamber of Commerce recently urging the administration to get back in there, negotiate a digital services agreement to start with other countries. And I think there's some concern among the business community generally that we need to be more active on trade, that the United States could be left behind. We're absent from the regional cooperation agreements in Europe. The 15 Asia Pacific economies have a free trade bloc, which is really cementing China's dominant role in the region. TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's why our industry is encouraged the administration to take a hard look at joining the TPP and seeking to further strengthen that agreement, even if possible. I mean, by the way, it's now called the CPTPP. I should say that, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we're hoping the U.S. will also continue to restart negotiations for free trade agreements with the United Kingdom, Kenya, and consider others. But again, I think also we have to say there's certainly a sense among global companies that we really need to figure out a way to also engage with China directly on economic and trade policy and in a forward-looking way. Our industry has been strongly opposed to the use of retaliatory tariffs as a means of resolving trade difficulties. And we hope that the removal of the China tariffs and continued dialogue on non-tariff barriers, especially in our case, regulatory barriers, could be the result of a re-energized effort in China.
I think there's generally been a lot of frustration with the amount of time it's taken for the Biden administration to do their trade policy reviews, not just of the China policy, but towards other allies. And the fact that these tariffs are still on. And companies are hurting. They're hurting American consumers. They're hurting American companies as much as they're, creating any leverage with the other parties. And to the extent that the Biden administration has started to unwind the tariffs, like with the steel and aluminum, it's been done in a very managed trade kind of way, which in my personal view, it does not bode well for where we're headed in terms of getting back to a pre-Trump administration position. I would say also, what I've been hearing from the business community contacts I have is a real frustration in a lack of interest in the administration on being an advocate for American business in their issues and interests overseas. There's clearly no bandwidth for it. There's not a lot of attention put to it. And I think they have made it very clear that the priority is this worker-centric trade policy going forward, and it leaves the business community a little bit out in the cold winter snow. Doesn't bode well going forward for sure.
I couldn't agree more with Caroline. I just sense a real frustration on behalf of the business community. They don't feel that their views are being incorporated into any forward-looking trade agenda. And they feel that the emphasis is so skewed toward trying to address the concerns of workers that they're being kind of, left out, with no real clear path to solving market access issues they have in different countries. And we're not pursuing trade agreements, which is not, helping them. And so, but all that said, my view is, having worked in trade policy for over 30 years, almost 40 years, we're not going back to where we were before Trump. Things have changed. The politics of trade has just gotten complex and uglier. And we're all going to need to work together to kind of find a new paradigm, because the old model, let's just be honest, it didn't work. It worked for a while, but we're no longer calling the shots in the global economy or the global trading system. So we need to, as a country, kind of figure out how we can still remain engaged robustly on trade and investment matters around the world, but still be able to garner the needed domestic support for that agenda. And we haven't been able to figure that out. And as a result, I think our business community will continue to be extremely frustrated. The question and my concern is that by the time we figure this out, is it going to be too late? It doesn't mean because we're ready to be back that the rest of the world is going to say, great, what can we do for you? Those rules may be made, they are being made without us, but they may become ironclad without us. And so again, we need to find a way to shape the rules, particularly in these emerging technologies in the digital space, AI, et cetera, or we're going to find a world with rules that really don't suit our interests.
Yeah, I so totally agree, Wendy. And I just would say, I think that one of the single biggest mistakes that Biden made was to discard TPP again and not go forward with that agreement. And I think of that as your agreement because you were so involved in the negotiation of it. But it seems to me that we've lost so much time by trying to come up with reworks where we could have embraced some of the good that had occurred in the past years.
But I think to Wendy, I agree with everything you've said. And to Wendy's point, though, the dynamics have changed, and they've certainly changed here at home. And the viewpoint of and this is across party lines. The viewpoint of Americans toward trade is really not as positive as those of us who are here on this podcast. And so I think the administration's focus on some kind of balance of if you don't have support domestically for the policies you're pursuing, it's very hard to try to be in a leading role on the world stage, at least as far as trade agreements. Your trade agreements, you can negotiate them, but they won't be either ratified in Congress or you'll have domestic opposition to the extent that you're almost weakened on the global stage. And so I think I have some understanding of the need to deal with, at least present trade in the context of addressing the needs of the U.S. Consumers and the American economy. Sure, the first year, trade policy has been viewed in something of a supporting role to those priorities. There's been a lack of momentum. There's no question. But I do think we are going into the second year of the administration, seeing a certain shift. Senior leaders are in place in Washington and in Geneva. We have resolved the tensions with the EU and Japan over the previous tariffs. There's been more congressional action to consider the GSP and other trade programs. We've mentioned these, the Indo-Pacific framework. So I think we can have hopefully some optimism that there'll be more focus in the next year or two on these trade agreements. And I'm not giving up on the U.S. joining TPP. It's certainly not been a priority, but perhaps this is something that could be seen in the context of the Indo-Pacific framework, in the context of America's leadership in APEC going forward.
No, but I agree. I think that, look, year two, the Biden administration is figuring out a trade policy, and I think we'll see more and more unfolding. I also think with respect to pursuing trade agreements, we can't discount the importance of pursuing domestic measures, whether they be safety net measures, education, retraining, et cetera, because what I always found in negotiating trade agreements is that everyone thought these agreements could take care of all of these issues. And trade agreements are useful, but they can only do certain things. They're not designed to do other things. And a lot of those other things are really should be the focus of domestic policies. And to the extent that the Biden administration is putting emphasis on those domestic policies, maybe that will help build momentum for becoming more of a leader on the international stage on trade matters.
Yeah, I think the investment in domestic competitiveness issues is really important, long overdue, and indeed, it helps. It responds to things that we should have learned with the losers in the domestic economy from the NAFTA, from China's accession to the WTO, from the other trade agreements. We, in the business community, we didn't pay enough attention to the need for better safety nets for those companies that were not only winning from these agreements, but the losers as well.
Francine, Wendy, and Carolyn, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us about issues of trade, get us smart on that stuff today. And, the Center for Strategic and International Studies has a podcast called The Trade Guys. I now think they have some serious competition. So you guys may want to start your own podcast without us. But anyways, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
That was part 2 of our look at trade, technology, and China. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please share the episode on social media and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us wherever they listen to podcasts. Join us next time for part 3, when we'll talk about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine affects trade. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. This episode was produced by Aaron Jones. Until we meet again.